Thank you all for coming. I have to say I'm somewhat jet lagged or seriously jet lagged. I'm not exactly sure which. So bear with me. I'm sorry if it's going to be like a little laggy, but it's also going to be somewhat experimental. The presentation that I'm going to be giving is going to be fairly written at the beginning, and then it's going to be kind of open towards the end because I'm still kind of working through these ideas. But hopefully you can kind of follow along, and I'd love to have a discussion with you about just what to make of this piece, which I've seen now several times, starting last October when I saw it in Shanghai in an exhibition there, and then more recently in Singapore. And so this is actually the third time I've encountered the piece. And the more I think about it, the more I kind of am less sure exactly what, what exactly to make of it. But I have some ideas, so I'm going to share those with you. So maybe we can begin with the first slide. Thanks. We begin here in a clearing of sorts, not quite sure what we are doing there. The view is pleasant enough, the greenery some distance away from us, on the other side of the grassy field visible in the foreground. And it's quite lush. The scene is bucolic, pastoral even, and we will come to see that it is, in fact, farmland. But then a voice appears, announcing in Cambodian that, quote, the year 1978 showed itself here. And instantly, a disquieting sense of foreboding takes over, casting a shadow over the verdant land, a kind of serpent in the garden. 1978, after all, was the third year of the brief but brutal reign of the CPK, the Communist Party of Kampuchea. In that time, the Khmer Rouge, as it was better known, systematically attempted to transform Cambodia into an egalitarian society modeled on the country's agrarian communities, its peasantry, free of foreign, read Western, influence. They did not succeed in this goal in the 5 years they had at their disposal, but they did manage to destroy much of the infrastructure and framework underpinning the previous society, doing away with factories, schools, hospitals, and even modern medicine, and eliminating currency and bank records to ensure that there would be no turning back. Under the command of President Pol Pot and Prime Minister Nguyen Cha, the Angkar, or organization as it called itself, forcibly relocated the urban populations, including children and the elderly, to rural communes, where they were put to work to grow food for the country, in place of any imports, which were now banned. Set with impossible goals and made to labor for 12 hours at a time, it is unsurprising that many, perhaps several hundred thousands, perished from starvation and exhaustion. In addition to this attack on urbanites, the Khmer Rouge also sought to purify Cambodia of foreign elements, which included supporters of the previous regime, ethnic Chinese and Vietnamese, as well as other non-Khmer peoples, devout observers of any religion, and professionals and intellectuals, which could include people suspected of being able to speak a foreign language or who simply wore glasses. As a result of their relentless program, the Khmer Rouge had managed, by the time they were deposed by North Vietnam in 1979, to kill through execution, torture, and deprivation of food and other basic human necessities at least 2 million people, or about 1 in 4 Cambodians, possibly as many as 1 in 3, according to some estimates. In other words, the simple statement about 1978 showing itself here, with which the film starts, maybe second slide, functions something like a Pandora's box, a world's worth of terror contained in a deceptively tiny thing. And yet, despite the genocidal horrors evoked through the mere reference to 1978, we are not immediately plunged into darkness or horror. Instead, we stay put at the field as the voice, the narrator delivering the monologue of Vandi Ratana's 2015 film, carries on in a calm, unflustered tone, describing how he and we have come to be here under the reach of 2 mango trees in the northwest of Cambodia, through a map drawn by the narrator's father. We come to realize that the one-person speech that gives the film its title is addressed to a second person, a you, whom the narrator has never met and never spoken to, and knows only through a photograph, in which, quote, "You are not talking, you're not smiling, you're by no means angry, you look as if you've just stopped crying," unquote. We can infer from the narrator's words that the you is someone born a few years before the narrator, perhaps a sibling, and a couple of minutes in are going to understand that the person, the you, is dead, since people no longer talk about you. Your name and your birth date are bound to sink into oblivion. You may be forgotten forever. It is only at this point in the film, nearly 3 minutes in, that someone with hair shoulder length and wearing a white shirt and gray pants, next, actually appears in front of the camera. In fact, Van Die himself, whose voice also happens to be the one delivering the monologue. Approaching from the position of the camera, he walks into the foliage, then disappears into the thickets. The speech continues, this time to extol the beauty of the mango trees, saplings in 1978. They have grown big now. They look slender, elegant, and are a beautiful sight. Furthermore, these pumsum mango trees, as the narrator identifies them, bear fruit that are sour when still green. Quote, "But when mixed with fish sauce, they taste exquisite and pair wonderfully with grilled fish. When ripe, they are sweet, flatter the palate, and smell delightful." As the frame cuts to some close-ups of views of the trees, Van Die notes, "The exuberant flowering of the mango trees are harbingers of a good harvest this year." At this point, one may be puzzled by how the exquisite taste and delightful smell of mangoes relate to the facts of the atrocities committed by the Khmer regime. Though the monologue up to this point has made no mention of the horrific events of that period, it has already intimated the death of the unseen second person who is the addressee of the monologue. And this alone makes a soft, dreamy, reflective tone of the piece, as set by the words of the speaker, somewhat striking. The imagery, in turn, responds more through evocation than outright depiction. We are never shown the you addressed by Van Die. Instead, the film consists of several long takes of the clearing and its surrounding glade of trees, interspersed with a few short close-ups and views of details of the surroundings. The mildness of Van Die's monologue may be disconcerting, especially for a US audience, given that most of our associations with Cambodia come from the Vietnam War and its aftermath in the Khmer Rouge regime. The association, in other words, is one of national calamity and bloody genocide. The most well-known representation of the Khmer Rouge period of Cambodia is, of course, The Killing Fields, a 1984 film directed by Roland Joffé, featuring Sam Waterston and Dr. Hang Ngor, which recounts the history through the eyes of Dit Phan, a Cambodian working with the New York Times and other newspapers who popularized the expression killing fields to describe the sites where the mass executions and burials took place. Dit experienced the violence firsthand while working for foreign newspapers, but also later when he was stranded in Cambodia after the foreign newspapers had left. And for 4.5 years experienced the full nightmare of life under the Khmer Rouge to work in a labor camp. And the film is unrelenting in its depiction of the brutalities of life and death in Cambodia at that moment. Given the full-on treatment to be found in The Killing Fields, one might wonder at the excursus on mango trees that Van Die undertakes. Monologue also stands in contrast to the artist's own earlier work, rooted as it is in photojournalism. And indeed, Van Die himself has worked with various newspapers and news sites around 2008, 2009, during his transition period into working fully as an artist. He had initially trained to be a lawyer, but stopped after 2 years in 2005. Even as Van Die began to create portfolios of images that were meant to be viewed in an art exhibition context, he still worked in a direct documentary mode, as is evident in these images. For instance, in one of his earliest series, called Looking In, the photo records the life of his family and domestic interiors. So this possibly is his mother, I'm not exactly sure. And just as the following year, he moved his investigation to the workplace in Looking In My Office, 2006, in which he sought to capture the everyday sense of the Camintel telecommunications company, Vandy's place of employment during 4 years. So here you can see people, a hand kind of reaching for a punch card. Here's someone's carrel or cubicle with the plants growing out of the Coke cup. And then here are some colleagues of his from work. And then someone sleeping on the job. His projects became more socially engaged in the years following, with series devoted to the rapid transformations in Phnom Penh, as in Bangkok Eviction, so next, from 2008, which showed the forcible removal of nearly 4,000 families, or over 15,000 people, as part of a filling in and redevelopment of a lake in central Phnom Penh. And here you see the kind of the squalor in which many of the people were living at the lake, but they were nevertheless expelled. And then here, Fire of the Year 2008, which documented a mass fire in a neighborhood. So here you can see the fire in full blaze, and then here people working to salvage what they can. And this one, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. So at this point, he hasn't made any moving image work. He's working strictly as a photographer. In 2009, Vandy also looked beyond the urban landscape, producing series such as Walking Through, which were created at rubber plantations dating to the French colonial period to examine present-day labor conditions. And here you see, so previously you saw the hands of a laborer, and here you see rubber sheets kind of being hung up and someone in the background. And then here's the plantation. In fact, it was his work on the plantations that led him to the discovery of the subject of another series from that same year, the craters, which were 30 to 50 feet wide and several yards deep, that were created during the Vietnam War, when the US military dropped 2.7 million tons of over 2.7 million tons of explosives around Cambodia in an attempt to attack the North Vietnamese forces who were taking refuge in Cambodia. The explosives wreaked havoc on the Cambodian countryside, killing those who found themselves close to the impact sites and creating several yard-deep craters that are often still toxic when filled with water. Today, the bomb ponds, as the locals called them, can still be found, but many in the urban areas, like Vandy himself, are not aware of this history. So one of the things that Vandy points out is that in 2009, the year that he made this series of work, which consists, ultimately, it's one piece which consists of 9 photographs and 1 video, and we're going to be watching the video. This was the same year in which the Cambodian government started teaching about the Khmer Rouge history. In other words, it was not until 30 years after that school children started learning about that history itself, officially, as opposed to unofficially having to piece it together from kind of family periods. And the other thing is that this was also the year when the Khmer Rouge, members of the Khmer Rouge were actually put on trial in 2009, even though that process had been initiated earlier. It wasn't until this year, 2009, that they were actually put on trial. So at this point, Vandy had come from this position where he had been working to create an archive of the present for the Cambodian people, because he felt that there were a lack of locally generated images and photographs. And so whereas there were Western photographers who were working in Cambodia, he was busy working to establish kind of the bases for Cambodian photographers to be working and documenting their own history and their own society from their own point of view. And he comes to this realization that there's actually periods of history that he's not aware of, including the bomb ponds, beginning with the bomb ponds. And so what we're going to see is an excerpt from the video that is part of the bomb pond piece, where he's trying to kind of speak with people who had been living in the countryside at the time of these explosions and what their experiences were. And I think it'll be relevant to then, thinking about how he handles his own history in monologue. So maybe at this point we can watch a bit of Bomb Pawns, the video.
mà mưa cho nâng phò tang rồi bỏ mấy căng
lấy bây giờ rồi dân đạo ông thuê đấy ông bà
ba sầm rạp oi cả bấy cả bấy cô cho thế tập bản năng thì ăn miên vô ta thơ sợi gì na nhái ăn đấy ăn miên pra cài cả thế hộp cô bằng cả hộp về nó chết rầm sêu nè cả bấy chúng cá ngọt đại xa ra nào nữa cả bấy cô vì miếng chết pol nâng ngọt đời xa ở đào nâng cái miếng phần vì lời nâng vì sao liệm tích vì muốn nó ngọt real pale tam vì sai sát cô sát cả bay ngọt đời xa trả tức ở đào này vì đòn đào hay cô có bấy máu hộp tức nâng cô kia tới hàm pung tới ngọt bà
riêng đào chỉ riêng bất mình men phút của họ hay mình men che thai trong bầu môi ôn trong đăng thàn đau nâng về miền nước trang cả lại tiết chân trong nom tầm mưa đau tiết mấy ở khinh bắt thàn đau gì đau bê hà pi bật bật còn oi tha trong mình dây những phút của họ mình men phút đây cứ chỉ ca bớt rồi bỏ dương thèm đòn chân ôn chơi tầm mưa thì đau mua nó phải chùm luôn pi rồi mai vì kia mình hai bia mặc xe bia chân mau bia tầm lệ mình xe bảo bia chân đau mua tôn đau mua phải chụp pi rồi mai như chị ăn đau thì pi đã cao dòng vì mưa nó háo nhưng mà khi ăn đau thì pi chứ đau thì pi chỉ đâu chiên kia nữa hai bia mình toàn và chia chân gọt toàn lúc ấy gọt tục còn do ăn đau nắng sọp pi là sau vì có vì ấy tao dựng ai bom bàn khác rồi có bàn chia tây nó không đăng bàn nè đau thì pi hàng đau mình cha đó tiết đây dừng rọp bia mình ói dừng có rọp biaแต่ทำlà thì pi nắng bàn này
American mà thưa ấy nè không chui Campuchia cho ngọt muốn đừng chui Campuchia mua là hết đây mà thưa nhỉ mơ ngọt Campuchia vào màn rồi vào màn liên vào màn pon vào màn tăng cô tăng gặp bay tăng sky tăng chma tăng manu tăng đam chơ và
bạn á men slap men ruột đôi y chăng nào men chim nang nang nâu đó nào ọt chim nang slap ấy pin tầm lúng cháu
cái nhóm ngọc đôi khmoi sky nơi tập đang chơi bạn nhóm tiền do tới đặt trong đá bạn nhóm tiền nhóm do tới đàn đá trong xe đấy mà vì pro việc tầm lẹ khang pe tầm lẹ crop bom hái thêm bom bí tới tiết ba tụ đôi bị đôi này thịt luôn nhá thịt liệt tu nhá bưng bang về ná tới tròn bạn mà trong nhóm ô ta nhóm trôn trong xe bạn không trong xe cọp bay chẳng nô bom bí trô không có bay tiếp nhom và miel ôn nhom nhom cái điện mà khang môi tranh bị trong xe tiếp thả công nơi không trong xe nhom cái điện môi nhom tranh bị trong xe tiếp tranh trong xe là bắc năng tiết là bắc cái bô trong xe năng tiết hai đôi chân chúng ta nè phò tang là bo nhom mình ai bảo cày ban លោកនៅនេះបាទរបស់អាមេរិកកាំងនេះធ្វើឲ្យស្លាប់ជាដូនជាតារបស់ខ្ញុំមីងមារបស់ខ្ញុំដោយសារនៅនេះបាទហ្នឹងរបស់អាមេរិកកាំង B52 បាទហ្នឹងតម្លាក់ក្របបូមតម្លាក់បូម B ដោយសារបាទហេតុដូច្នោះខ្ញុំមិនចង់ឃើញទេខ្ញុំអត់ចង់ឲ្យឃើញទេបាទរណ្ដៅអស់នេះខ្ញុំអត់ឲ្យចង់ឃើញទេបាទចឹងបាទខ្ញុំនៅលើភ្នំខ្ញុំនៅលើភ្នំខ្ញុំអត់ឲ្យឃើញដៅទេនៅតែលើភ្នំឲ្យនៅមានឃើញដៅទៀតបាទខ្ញុំឃើញយាយខ្ញុំស្លាប់ហូរឈាមម្លាក់ឡាសុទ្ធនេះឆ្អែតទៅបាទខ្ញុំនិយាយលេងកើតហើយបាទខ្ញុំដោយសារក្មួយទេមកណាថាចង់ស្គាល់ចេះស្គាល់ចង់បាទខ្ញុំកាត់ចិត្តព្រោះខ្ញុំឃើញដល់នេះខ្ញុំខោចចិត្តណាស់អ៊ំខ្ញុំយាយខ្ញុំមីងខ្ញុំងាប់ដោយសារតាវាហ្នឹងបាទខ្ញុំបាទខ្ញុំអស់ខ្ញុំបល់និយាយទៀតហើយកូនបាទ
ឪពុកខ្ញុំត្រូវចំក្បាលបែកក្បាលនឹងឈាមចេញទាំងអស់យើងមើលគាត់លេងចង់ស្គាល់ហើយអាំបែកងារមកឃ្លៀតទៅត្រង់ហ្នឹងទៅពីក្រោយផងពីនឹងផង
Okay, so what you see there is something that's maybe more paradigmatic of, a documentary treatment of historical trauma, and the way that it records the experiences of those who had been through the experience. And I think that here, one of the things that I want to talk about is that this exhibition, the exhibition of Vandiratana's monologue takes place within the context of the Mistakes Room project. And I think that it's rightly that related to the question of post-memory, which is one of the issues addressed by all of the work in these in the 4 chapters, right? And indeed, the notion of post-memory proposed by Marian Hirsch, which describes the relationship of the generation after those who witnessed cultural or collective trauma, bears to the experience of those who came before, experiences that they, quote unquote, remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up, and which operate as a kind of common thread to the 4 chapters forming the Histories of a Vanishing Present, a prologue, precisely pertains to the questions that could be asked of Vandi's work. And I think it's very pertinent here as he's trying to kind of go about and reconstruct the past, right? On the basis of the recollections of others. At the same time, some of the assumptions that underline Hirsch's framework in analyzing post-memory, which mainly take the Holocaust as its prime example, do not translate in the context of Cambodia. Thus, whereas those living in the wake of the Holocaust are confronted by a vast number of photographic images that were kept by perpetrators, by bystanders, and by victims, it is precisely the transmission of this image bank produced by people who were there and which had been received by subsequent generations who were not, that makes photography central to Hirsch's discussion of post-memory. In the case of Cambodia, photography precisely is what is absent. There are no photographs, or there's a paucity of photographs in this context that document all of these things. And so what Vandi had been trying to do is document the present, and in this piece, the bomb ponds, we see, or in the video anyway, to any effect, we see him trying to document the past as well, to create an archive of the past. But what happens is when we look at the photographs, and maybe you can skip forward one, and you see him here photographing one of the bomb ponds, and then we move forward one more. And so this is this is the image that was produced, and then one more. And here's another bomb pond. And a third one. And something strange, I think, happens in the transition from the video to the photograph, which is that the photographs are not actually very forthcoming about that history. What they give us is this kind of image of this, very much like the image that we saw at the beginning of Monologue. That is to say, we see a very lush place that, in the absence of any knowledge, we would just assume to be a beautiful kind of clearing, right? And I think this is one of the things that motivates Vandi's move in Monologue to completely kind of do away with the documentary, or kind of to try to recover, to do away with the project of recovery, I guess. That's from the monologue, from the film. So that normally plays next door.
And then how does that relate to these other stuff?
So this was made, okay, so these are 3 of the 9 image photographs that were made in 2009 as part of the Bomb Pond series. And then Monologue was made last year in 2015. So what happens, I think, through the production of this series, or this piece, The Bomb Pond, is that he begins to move away from a strictly documentary approach where he's trying to either document the present or the past and move into the questioning of what exactly the images are and how they relate to history and how they can relate to history. And I think that it's that doubleness that he wants precisely to capture in Monologue, which is not just, the horror of the past versus the banality of the present. It's that the banality of the present lies on, or the beauty of the present lies on the horror of the past and is fed by it. So this, for instance, is a kind of a general image, not by Vandi, but just kind of taken by tourists of another killing field. So these are the killing fields, or the mass graves, where thousands and thousands of people were buried. And so what you can see in this photograph is, something very similar in some ways to the bomb ponds, in that, nature has kind of grown up in the place where thousands of people were buried. And you can see the bones, right, on the right-hand side of the image where people have found them. And today, apparently, it is still possible to wander into these fields and find bits of tooth or bone, just simply because the graves were so shallow, and when the rains come and they wash the dirt away, then the bones kind of sink up. And this kind of imagery is something that he avoids. And then move forward 1. He also avoids the photography that you could find in S21, which is the museum documenting the tortures. And in fact, it is the site for this museum because it had been a schoolhouse that was converted into the place where the Khmer Rouge tortured over 17,000 people, I think. And only 3 of them actually walked out from that place alive. So there were only 3 survivors out of 17,000 people out of this place. But the Khmer Rouge took photos of every single one of the victims. And so there are these photographs. This is the one place where there wasn't a systematic attempt to document people who were killed during this process. Right, so this is precisely the kind of imagery that he avoids. And he also avoids, one more, he avoids the kind of approach which is taken by this particular survivor of the Khmer Rouge, which is to create a killing fields museum, which is to kind of memorialize the past, right, and what had happened in the past. Move forward 1. And I think this kind of distanciation is something that he kind of is in evidence in the series of photographs he took of the Khmer Rouge tribunal, in other words, the court in which members of the Khmer Rouge were tried in 2009. And you can see in these photographs that he took, he purposely distances us from the proceedings of the trial. He shows us not the trial itself, not the people being tried, but rather the apparatus of the media that is recording, that is documenting this. So here you see the television screen with the judge and the recording devices, and the next, and the tripods. And then here are Buddhist priests outside. And he even kind of, focuses his gaze on the food that was being sold to the journalists. And here you see in the screen, the tribunal taking place, but in the foreground, someone drinking their coffee. And never once does he actually give us, a direct representation of the tribunal. It's always at a distance, at a remove. Even here, which seems to be a close-up of someone, you can tell that it's actually a close-up of a television screen. And here is actually one of the 3 survivors from S21, from the torture compound, Van Nath, who was himself an artist and a writer, being interviewed by the press. And what's interesting is that in addition to these kind of named series of work that Vandi creates, he also keeps a photo diary. And so you can see the way that the photo diary kind of informs this. So these are from his photo diary and pictures of Van Nath. And you can tell from the photo diary that he was very much aware of the responsibilities of the artist in Cambodia, given that most artists were slaughtered and did not survive the Khmer Rouge period. And so those who did had a certain responsibility to kind of rebuild. And here's a photo from 2011 when Van Nath had passed away, taken in Paris where Vandi was living at the time. And what's interesting is that Van Nath himself had made in, I think it was 2003, a film called S21, which was precisely a documentary that returned to the site with one of the other survivors and some of the torturers, and actually went through the painful process of having their torturers recount the process of what they had done to their victims as he's filming this. So in some ways, the victims, he and one of the other ones are reliving this experience as he's making this documentary. So that's the approach that Vandi certainly was aware of and familiar with, but ultimately does not take in monologue. So we return to monologue, and here you see one of the shots that kind of intermittently appear, and it's this kind of blurry image of the bamboo trees that surround the mango. And then eventually we actually see the farmers who work the field, the killing field itself, right? And we begin with a close-up of their hands as these gleaners. I think what they're doing is harvesting the rice as they're picking individual bits, right? And it's this laborious process as you see them picking bits off the ground. And then before the camera then switches to this fisheye view of the entire field, and you see these 3 farmers working the field. And I think the point that Vandi is trying to make is that he's trying to kind of, as he states, how the beauty of the present is precisely built or kind of fed by the death of the past. And so at some point he has a statement that he had heard that these 2 pumsum trees had grown as a sole result of the human fertilizer from these 5,000 souls, right? So just as the mangoes are blooming, are in blossom and fragrant and delicious because of the remains of the 5,000 people that lie under them, so the rice fields themselves are fertilized by the remains of these people. And the Cambodian farmers are precisely working these fields because they have no other option. That's what sustains them. And it's this kind of the coexistence of the present and the past that Van D is indicating, I think, and kind of refusing, and I think deliberately refusing the kind of the rhetoric of horror and terror that characterizes much documentary, including Killing Fields. And in some ways, I think he's going for something which is much more about how the necessity of living in the present. And I think that's reflected not just in the way that, you know, he has these kind of images that are constantly of what is actually the site itself in the present day, but also the way that he structures this monologue. Because, you know, originally he said that in an interview that the film was originally going to be called Tell Me Your Story, where he was going to tell the story of his parents. And because his parents precisely no longer at all talk about the wartime, they simply don't. And until he had asked them about the picture of the girl, he didn't realize that that was of his sister, right? And so it was precisely this kind of refusal to talk that he was interested in, he wanted to interrogate. And so he said that, you know, at my house, my parents' house, where I used to live when I was young, we have a small black and white photo on the wall, and had no idea who this person was. And one day when I was young, I asked my parents to tell me the story of the girl. Actually, she is my sister. And then when he went in 2015, he said, when I found my sister's grave, which I don't expect that at all, is the story of my parents. How could I find the grave of my sister like that? I didn't expect that at all. For me, it's just a fiction. It's just a fiction in my scenario. Of course, my sister died. When I found out this was the place where my sister was buried, so everything just became like quiet. For me, it's just like a moment of melancholia, he continues. I don't have direction. I try to be sincere. I try to be sincere to see what is inside me, you know, because I spend 1.5 hours at the mass grave and write everything down with all my anger, the fear, the hopelessness, the loneliness, something like that. Of course, it's about myself, you know, myself who I can say has been haunted by the story my parents told me. So in some ways, and you know, he points out that this story is quite common, that there are many people who have lost family members or their entire families, right? And in fact, you know, Ditpran, the protagonist in The Killing Fields, lost 50 members of his family in Siem Reap. They were all completely gone. So he's talking about this process of the experience of what it's like to be living in present-day Cambodia with this kind of spectral past that is still there, but which people don't know about. And so in that sense, I think it presents an interesting contrast to the genocide, the issue of genocide as it's been treated, you know, by Hirsch and others with regard to the Holocaust. And I think, you know, this is maybe a place to open the discussion up for questions, you know, about what Van D's piece, you know, may be doing.